Hello everyone, today we talk about the 1682 attempt to frame Imre Thököly by the side of the Empire and the Papacy against the Ottomans and Louis XIV. It's not the first time we talk about Hungary in the broader context of the 1683 Ottoman siege of Vienna, and we also explained relatively recent times a bit better what was Royal Hungary, Habsburgic Hungary essentially, and by extension, in fact, the rest of the country historically, after essentially the partition between the Turks and the Austrians. What had been really the broader crown that, of course, was being always let's say, claimed by the various sides, and from a local Hungarian perspective, of course, also in an autonomistic sense, right? Especially those who controlled the say the more developed part of the country. It's the Habsburgs were the ones who had the upper hand. Hadn't there been a massive Ottoman deterrent still, and as in fact the events of the following year would prove, the hard way to actually incorporate the the entire territory, right? And in fact that also after the Ottoman siege, the failed Ottoman siege, the Austrians began to swarm into vast territories that had belonged to the previous, say, wall, right, of the Hungarian crown. Today we will focus, however, especially on this diplomatic efforts to bring the leader of the anti-Habsburgic resistance, essentially created, fueled by Louis XIV and the Ottomans, Imre Thököly, and specifically a compromise that even the papacy was willing to make in order to essentially negotiate with Thököly's Calvinist faction, a compaction of both, the part of Ottoman Hungary and the Banate of Croatia, on which, as we'll see now, Thököly had essentially extended his control by marrying the heirs, right, to the Banate, at the cost of course, like dealing with a Protestant, but possibly, say, stripping this territory from the Ottomans, or at least having an upper hand on them politically, morally, in some way. This actually was a bit not necessarily utopistic, because everything is always possible, but of course a pretty meager compromise that did not really happen. There were negotiations, but as we will see, essentially there is an Habsburgic willingness to compromise with the Calvinists in this case, mostly due not much to the Ottoman detriment that obviously was pretty powerful, but also the French one, right? Essentially, Leopold I's policy was revolving around sort of absolute appeasement. He wouldn't even want to believe actually that the Ottomans were essentially to launch a major operation like the siege of Vienna until the last month, right, when actually the army had already been put together. And this was always also the ambiguity of Hungary, right? This was essentially a failed state that had also stupefied, we can say, as far as this continuous tumultuous movements of war bands, of rebels and external actors was concerned. By the way, the Poles would reject this compromise with the Hungarians because Jan Sobieski really had quite at heart the plan of seizing the crown of Hungary for himself through a dynastic marriage of his son with a daughter of Leopold I. That is also quite interesting. We covered in other videos. And that we like to look at this international thermometer, diplomatic exchanges, because they sort of reveal you how sort of fluid, dynamic, and quite, say, also structured, thanks to the institutions, to the ambassadors, to the spies, informers, how this game would go. Now, the move, matrimonial move we were talking about before, is the, in fact, marriage of Imre Thököly on June the 15th, 1682, with Ilona Zrínyi, the daughter of Peter Zrínyi, and so essentially the niece of the legendary Bane of Croatia, Miklos, widow of Ferenc I Rákóczi. These were all influential characters, like in the Croatian affairs. They had essentially held the rule of the country that was, as you know, under the Habsburgs. This is a gateway to Serbia, to the Hajduk resistance against the Turks that the Austrians and the Venetians were fueling, were paying. And the objective of Thököly, that had been dreaming of this marriage for a long time, we do not know whether also for more romantic reasons, but evidently for quite strongly political one, had naturally been achieved thanks to, in fact, the imperial consensus. And of course, equally aimed at the connection of Hungary and Croatia as a sort of southern frontier within the Habsburgic Empire. The Habsburgs had not been particularly happy to grant Thököly after all the issues that he had created, sort of the hostile intents and actions that he had, in fact, displayed, carried out in the previous years. This was a competent leader, but for this reason, like, not to be trusted. And in fact, Thököly had derived a lot of fame, power, for this ultimate goal of his to rule, especially over reunified and, say, liberated Hungary. The problem was exactly this. Like, what does it mean to liberate Hungary from whom? Like, if we take sort of a broader national perspective, of course, like, you could think of, you know, as far as the Hungarian language goes. But the question is, you know, what did it mean for Thököly at that time? This intricate political game, the local nobility, of essentially this tripartition of like the Habsburgic Hungary, essentially this Ottoman controlled one, and then also Transylvania, that was a vassal, as you know, the Sublime Porte, and especially considering that he was really a pawn used and moved by the Sun King and the Turks. And so the question was also the point, who would actually even free what from whom, how much territory would be given to him, and what would happen, by the way, to Hungary during this. Like, we've seen it also in other videos, because when the Ottomans would invade Austria, because you see now the land controlled by Thököly would work as a launchpad, but would be crossed by the Ottoman and Tatar forces that definitely were not, especially the latter, particularly kind-hearted souls, especially these foreigners that he didn't give a damn about. And so Thököly's Hungarian crown, that of course the Ottomans had actually offered to him in exchange for this ultimate blow to the golden apple of Vienna, was extremely costly also for him, at least in front of course, like the Hungarian people, that, let's remember also, to a large extent was actually Catholic, and understood pretty well like the sort of messed up situation was being formed. And even from the Calvinist side, of course, there were sort of different groups, factions, and we've seen in the last video about this topic, about the Zrínyi, the Rákóczi, the Frank Cipan, etc., was incredibly unstable, right? Very difficult to, and also because, of course, the continuous raids happened from the within, from the other side, etc. So this marriage with the Zrini meant for this enterprising Count Imre a very precise thing, that the of course the magnates that disliked the Habsburgs were many, but that they lacked a leader. In fact, since the death of the Bane of the Ban of Croatia, in actually a very sort of plain way, typically aristocratic hunting accident in November 1664, really had found themselves without much, as we were just saying, of a cohesion. That had created problems in this sense also for the Hungarians, and so the possibility of receiving a greater support from this neighboring nobility for a common neighbor even. And of course, there was an hostility between the Croatians and the Hungarians in the first place. But in any case, this marriage was at least an opportunity to provide with the option of fixing the thing, because marrying the heirs to the Zrini meant to sort of reclaiming their legacy, and so also assuming the responsibility of that role of political recompaction. The marriage between Thököly and Zrini were very luxuriously celebrated in the castle of Munkacs in June, as we've seen in 1682. But they had a much bigger meaning, and also a much more complex one than merely like a ceremony. The dame, by the way, was 14 years older than her ambitious husband. She seemed really, maybe not in love. We don't know actually whether she had any true feeling towards him. However, she was glad of this marriage. She was interested politically in this union, and so infatuated or not, she was much into him. Thököly seemingly did not really care too much about her. However, in spite of the sincerity of her enthusiasm, because her family's vassalage to here it was not technically even the emperor to them, it was the king of Hungary, right? That's what the Habsburgic rule was about in that land as well, that had belonged in fact to the crown of Hungary. And it doesn't matter whether, of course, the same Zrini had been a bit restless in that relationship, but it was necessary really to follow the imperial guidance, because Croatia, by the way, was a Catholic country, and there was a broader care also in receiving defense from the Habsburgs, even though the local defense, as we've seen also in other videos, was mostly devoted to some sort of military colonies, very often also refugees coming from the same Ottoman Empire that had been resistant. So not the most efficient one, that the Habsburgic administration was quite ferocious still at this point. In any case, that they were also the bigger power, and so Croatia sort of depended on them anyway. They would look at Vienna more than, of course, they would at Thököly. Wu, from his side, considered, exactly for this reason, the marriage with the Zrini as an instrument to change his own relation with Vienna, and or at least to play more broadly, like to be able to make more leverage on it. In fact, needless to say, such marriage had been agreed because there had been some sort of pacification at stake. Right? He had promised the demobilization of the so-called Kurusok. I made a video about that. It were essentially the anti-Habsburgic Calvinist faction. In exchange, in fact, for the hand of the lady and the concession to Thököly through this also like a foothold, like in royal Hungary, that he inspired to really as a crown for himself. This was, by the way, like all like wishful thinking to a degree, right? The sense was that had this full crown of Saint Stephen actually being given to Thököly, goes without saying, the loyalty to the Habsburgs had to be crystal, right? They couldn't switch to the Ottomans. They couldn't play all that again. That's why this was actually wishful thinking, because Thököly did not really have a power basis that could ensure that, right? This is why this thing will actually fail. But it's important to discuss it because this is literally 1 year before Vienna, and it speaks volumes about the volatility of the situation, but also the desperation of the situation. In fact, Leopold, after the usual excitations, that he was a bit undecisive and insecure and sort of very chthonic and absconditus almost, had accepted like only the first request, that is to say, okay, marriage with the HRE, and you disband the Kuruczok and you basically pacify the situation. But the crown of Hungary, the crown of Saint Stephen, no, right? In fact, from the Habsburg side, the core of the matter was accepting like an immediate rebellion had he refused like even a smaller say condition, that is the marriage, or a more in fact distanced rebellion that could have been more or less repressed successfully had he agreed in fact to part of it. The Hungarians were not to be trusted, and of course accepting all the conditions was just insane. They would have never done it. And even if, say, ex absurdo, the Habsburg had accepted Thököly's requests, the Hungarian supporters of the Habsburgic house, we've seen the Kuruczok were the opposition, the Labancsok were instead the supporters, would have been completely lost. Basically, the Habsburgs would have alienated all those who had, and not just in Hungary, by the way, in this other surroundings as well, who had said, what the hell, what are you doing? In fact, the interesting part of this is that there were some influent characters in the Viennese court that actually were pushing for helping Thököly in just, we'll see now why, of course, because they wanted sort of to stamp the French interference in that era. For example, the so-called Spanish party was, at least in this case, represented by the ambassador of Spain, interested to essentially divert the Habsburgic forces as much as possible from the Danubian front to instead intervene in the west on the Rhine that was being penetrated by the Sun King, and so indirectly helping Spain on the other side of the French border, right? And in fact, the Spanish were particularly insensitive about sort of anything that normally the Austrian Habsburgs were going through from their own side of the aisle. They, to some degree, understandably, just pursued some greater effort from the other side. But in this sense, they were also trying not to ignite any significant, to fuel any significant conflict in a region that would have absorbed the Habsburgic forces. These were the two options for the Habsburgs, fighting either against the Turks or against the French. And we've seen these two scenarios in the complicated way that this almost paralyzed the Habsburgic monarchy by this point was mostly trying to avoid in the first place because they didn't have the money to begin with, mostly just preserving if you want, even giving the initiative to the enemy, that, as we know, strategically speaking, being very, very detrimental, in fact. And this is why this whole thing would actually culminate with 1683. And so the Spanish were literally saying things like that, after all, giving Hungary to Thököly was the best thing because there was no other solution. The Turks would have otherwise taken it for themselves. And it actually, for how crazy it was, this seemed just sort of more pragmatic perspective, right? Align yourself with a Calvinist power literally created by the Muslims and your greatest opponent from the Christian side, exactly to infest you, and giving them a crown that technically actually belongs to you, right? This is how deteriorated the situation really seemed. And what is striking is also that the Holy See was at least inclined towards this solution, even though very well knowing that this equated to a strengthening of the Protestants within the Habsburgic dominion. But St. Peter so he was very aware of this. If the most important objective was resisting the Ottomans, after all, even giving Hungary to the Protestants meant to subtract them from and as a great ally, because they had really been creating a lot of problems to the Habsburgs, from the greater enemy, the Ottomans. And exactly for this reason, Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland, was not at all happy, as we said. He had actually entrusted his secretary, Talenti, this was an Italian diplomat, to in fact write to Rome, to the Cardinal Protector of the King of Poland, Carlo Barberini, where the same June 1682, the same time of the marriage of Thököly with Zrini, and explaining, say, to warning the Pope regarding this. The letter said something along this line: "Your Eminency will have surely heard how Thököly, the head of the Hungarian noblemen, had been in Buda," so the Ottoman, say, capital of Hungary. In fact, by that Pasha, with not ordinary magnificence, with say, against some provisions, with that it would have had, but actually making him like a lot of reverence. In this sense, the Poles were quite concrete, like themselves. They said, "How can you deal with a traitor? Like, how can you deal with someone who basically arrives and in the capital of Ottoman Hungary, and like so magnificently clad and dealing with the circuit? It's sort of disgusting." In fact, as it had to be expected, shortly afterwards, Thököly himself bailed out of this Habsburgic negotiations, because God knows how much resistance, even within, from the other side, and the same Ottomans and the French were not particularly happy with this deal. Essentially, restarting his rebellion and hostile acts, right? He, after all, had not much of a capacity to even hold his own Magyars against like further Ottoman pressure. Two things Thököly had asked to the emperor, and having obtained only one, he had decided that the other one would have been granted to him by the Padishah. And so, in other words, yes, he had managed to marry Zrini, but the Ottomans would have given him a Hungarian crown. And just to explain how shameless the whole thing had been, only 10 days after the marriage, he had essentially rejected the agreements with the Viennese court and visited Buda, right, where Ibrahim Pasha was. And hadn't this been enough, he had eventually gone with the latter to the same Constantinople, right? And so basically the treaties that had been signed in the July of 1682 recognized from the Ottoman side the title of Prince of Upper Hungary to Thököly under the Sultan's protectorate, right? And so obviously you understand what this means, say, in a general perspective, like how dependent the same Thököly was on the Ottomans all along, and how, of course, it's not that he could negotiate who knows what, right? Here he was just pressed between two powers that were much bigger than him anyway. And needless to say, behind this there was also Louis XIV. Right, there was definitely a lot of French gold that had arrived, both in Constantinople but also in Hungary, to convince the people who needed to be convinced. And contrasting so much the Habsburgs with Hungary and the Ottomans as a consequence meant for France to essentially buy time and de facto territory in the Rhineland as well, right? Because they had paid for it on the Danube, and the results would be seen from the other side. And so Thököly didn't lose time. By the way, he reopened hostilities against the Habsburgs, and he attacked the fortress of Cassa, where he set, by the way, his own residence, even just to affirm more strongly his independence from the Habsburgs. And then, obeying precise order of the Ottomans, and together with Ottoman auxiliaries that had been sent straight from Buda by the Pasha, and also, by the way, by the Transylvanians, by the work of the Prince Apafi, he put his hands on the other strongholds, such as the one of Thököly, the walls of which he blew up, and where on August the 15th, so you understand everything happening, matter some weeks, an envoy of the Ottoman Sultan gave him a document providing, in fact, the Sultanian seal, with which the title of King of Hungary was bestowed on him. Naturally, this was just a fiction in some ways. Of course, it was just like an appointment that could not even properly be accepted by Thököly, in fact refused, because he himself proposed something less dramatic that he could, because you would have had at that point to defend literally the title of King of Hungary, which was ridiculous in the current situation, because they didn't have, of course, a control on all Hungary in spite of this sort of military comeback. And so again, the Prince Lord of the parts of Hungary, this is what he accepted. This again tells you how, say, if it hadn't been such a dramatic history, it would also be sort of ridiculous. He, however, would accept the, which also is sort of very significant, who was actually in charge there. He accepted the Ottoman insignia, the steppe toque with the ponytail, the banner and the sword that essentially gave him like a political territorial power, like a provincial governor, on behalf, let's say, in the name of the Padishah, and so as a servant of the Sublime Porte. right? And he began to mint even coins that displayed. I inserted some pictures of that here. The Borodin sign of inscription of Emericus Dux Ungari, so Imre, the Duke of Hungary, which is also, again, mostly like a military title than anything, or some broader, not even a governor, but a military commander. Excuse me, I drink a little. By the way, he operated some confiscations along the way. This was a brutal endeavor. He, for example, subtracted money to the Jesuits that were kicked out of the territories that he controlled, and he dreamed at least of founding a new university in Appeasement that would be Prešov. By the way, we are talking all different here. For example, we mentioned Kassa before, that would be Košice, right? So these are all the different terms by which, of course, we should also understand a different nomenclature in the cultural geography. And so that's why it's interesting to look at these theaters as well. In a different moment, as well as a different context, all this would have essentially provided itself for what it really was. This was high treason in rebellion from the Habsburg side, to say the least. And so politics was actually manifesting in the more concrete way, and so beyond wishful thinking. At this point, Thököly was legitimately the stronger figure in Hungary, in spite of the, again, lack of independence fundamentally. However, in spite of this, and exactly because this person was so powerful, Vienna couldn't simply bail out of the deal, or at least they would, but or as we've seen, like Thököly's power was dependent on Constantinople, and since the Viennese court did not want a break with the port at this point in any way, that they didn't want the war, they didn't want to spend, they didn't want to be destabilized in any way, they thought that an agreement of some sort could still be possible. This tells you also, again, in which dire straits the Habsburgs were pressed by the Ottomans and Louis XIV. And in all this, while the rebels of Thököly were devastating the Hungarian countryside, in Royal Hungary, on the Habsburg side, those aforementioned fortresses had been lost. There were even some liars at the Viennese court, especially in the Spanish part, excuse me, I drink a little once again, that basically said, there's no way actually the Ottomans are going at war with you, because look at what, in fact, this very Magyar puppets of theirs are doing. They're destroying Hungary. They're raising the lands. If an army had to graze here, wouldn't find anything, no forage, no invasion, so don't worry, they're just, doing their own thing. They're these scoundrels that, yes, are allied with the Turks, but don't worry. Actually, this was a pretty naive idea, because even if Hungary had been so devastated and desolated by such operations, the Ottoman army was so large that a bit of provincial pillaging and earth scorching actually would have been irrelevant, right? The Ottoman army, we talked about their size, and at least we never discussed their logistics in depth, but we've seen essentially what was the scale of their strategic projectional capacity. And of course, whatever had happened in Hungary, of course, hadn't, first of all, deprived it of all resources, but secondly, they would have simply passed at some point. And there was still plenty of resources also from Buda that were available. And even to the same, Thököly was operating with some. So this was just plain sort of bad advice with very, biased political objectives. it was exhausting objectively to look at what was going on, also between the French and the imperial diplomacy that was going on. Louis XIV was intensifying, as we've seen at this point, the efforts to convince the Sultan that that was the right moment to push at the fullest against the empire. Right? Again, remember that, as I said before already, the invasion of Vienna had not yet been even planned at this point. But of course it was possible to mobilize such forces as they would do it, because they would decide at the end of summer for the following year, and just making it happen with that massive scale. So the French knew that this was feasible, of course, and they sort of signaling Constantinople that this was the right moment, while fakely reassuring the emperor that, of course, there were no ill intentions and that no war would have broken out, that the French were really not behind this. I mean, everybody knew that they were, but that really there wasn't much of an interest that the Sun King had, except in fact the erosion of the Rhineland. That was all what the French were concerned. Of course, they wouldn't bother the Turks for their affairs. This was not very credible, but that was the least they could do, at least. On November the 12th, 1682, Hermann, or the Margrave of Baden, that was suffering of gout and was being informed of all these events by the Bishop Sinelli, was ensuring the ambassador, the French ambassador Sebeville, that the renewal of the treaty with the Turk was imminent, and that, after all, everything that the Sultan demanded was the control of Upper Hungary. So basically, this ally of the Habsburgs was telling the French, look, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans will find a deal. Of course, as you've seen, Sinelli was telling him how things really were. So in other words, they were buying time to show that the Habsburgic Ottoman channels were open and that they were negotiating. So there was not really much that the French could really do. And observing that Thököly, after all, was already in control of Upper Hungary, that that tribute that was entailed to be paid of 40,000 ECU was not this huge sum. So there was no real issue here, that the Habsburgs and the Ottomans would have found solutions by themselves. Nobody really knows, even here, how they could really bluff to this degree, but again, also from their side, that's really the best they could do. Right? It had been an actual agreement between Caprara, was the imperial ambassador in this, and the same Ottoman vizier Kara Mustafa. And of course, Hermann had been surpassed. Right? So Hermann of Baden knew perfectly well what was going on, what kind of goulash, right, was boiling, diplomatically speaking, between the Habsburgs and the Magyars. And there was at least some effort to keep, in fact, the channels with the same Hungarians open, because of the ambiguity that, after all, existed also with this very heavy Ottoman presence. The Spanish party was, again, pushing for giving the Turks and the Magyar rebels literally everything. They were so, again, without scruple, just to say, okay, give them all, and then what? Right, so they will become stronger and they will be an ever bigger problem. It didn't make much sense. This, in part, of course, was thought on sort of a short-ranged time, let's say, provision, like the sense that, of course, things could be stopped now, so to buy time on other fronts does make sense, but in the longer run, you're just basically destabilizing the Habsburgic Empire with what's even there to gain for Spain in a broader sense. So Leopold that needed to show at this point as the emperor that he was playing seriously, granted on November the 19th to his very, as we've seen, unpleasant Hungarian interlocutor an armistice on the base of what? Of essentially the recognition of a legitimate government on Royal Hungary until at least the Grand River, that is to say excluded, this was very important, the minery cities of Hungary that were, again I gave a picture of Habsburgic Hungary during the 16th century. This is largely valid also for the 17th. These were very important for, of course, the local economy, so the Habsburgs wanted to maintain them. And 6 fortresses that in fact would have remained within Royal Hungary, garrisoned by Austrian forces. And so this now Count, Duke, Prince Thököly, whichever sort of title would fit, that, however, had achieved a much greater power than before, admittedly, summoned immediately what essentially was dispatched for an Hungarian national diet that was dissolved shortly afterwards, expressing the vote that Thököly was capable of summoning what could be called a real Hungarian national diet or even parliament at that point. It was not even just saying, okay, well, you don't have that power now, but it was saying like, okay, we can actually achieve it, at least in theory. And so this was not really a positive response for Thököly, who at that point had to negotiate some sort of better deal with the Habsburgs, who, as we've seen, were also tendentially favoring this situation. For example, the confiscated goods were restored to the rebels, the exiles could come back to their homes, the Protestant communities could reopen houses and schools. This was a big deal. And so there was, if you want to link up between the Sultan's decree in September and imperial concession of November, you could even speak at least of autonomous Upper Hungary, so this Royal Hungary less some aspects. So with what effectively would turn out to be a sort of shared Austro-Ottoman protectorate, with a naturally stronger prevalence of the Turks, as far as, you know, they were the ones with the upper hand, because Thököly was kept being armed and supported. And so there was actually even a step back from the Ottoman side, because in June the Grand Vizier had almost dictated to the imperial ambassador this, okay, you're completely out of there, go out, and of course the Habsburgs had not accepted. But when you look at this situation, you realize that the Habsburgs actually did lose a lot of ground in the process. And there was now essentially an Ottoman extension of power would be used in the following year, as we were saying before, as a launchpad against Vienna. It was more like Transylvania at this point. It was more like a sort of Ottoman protectorate. You could compare with Hungary. Transylvania before the truces of Vassar that we've seen in another video. And that had to do with Poland as well, but again, today we will not talk about that again. And this internationally had a great cost, because the Habsburgic prestige was sort of stained. That is, they showed that they were weak. This did not appease the Turks at all. That's showing weakness, granting things to others, does not render anything, right? If you are powerful, if you have balls, you actually strike back and push. You never give anything to anyone, ever, right? That's an imperial Catholic traditional value, right? And this is what also the siege of Vienna actually reveals. And especially when you're actually stronger than you think. As you understand now, as we were hinting at before, essentially the Habsburgs here had been intimidated by the French, mostly. By French military power, I mean, in spite, as we've seen, of the nice, aside from the fact that we're invading the Rhine, little detail there, they literally thought even of the French as more powerful than they actually were in that context. In other words, the Habsburgs were sort of underestimating themselves. And I will not digress here on the idea of Leopold being sort of a bit of an irresolute, insecure individual, etc. It's not much the point. It was a serious situation. This was being, as we've seen, evaluated with the Allies and people that understood the situation. It was a serious situation, but this is exactly the moment in which you don't back down. Instead, they did. There was the only actual positive outcome of this for the Habsburgs, that in relative terms, if it, what happened the following year sort of pales really in comparison, is that there was some temporary capacity or potential intervention of the Habsburgs in the western borders of the Reich. So to actually stop, to at least to try to stem the French there. And so this is pretty messed up situation. It tells you how both, say, for example, if you think about the Catholic Austrians and the Hungarians, right, or to the imperial councillors belonging to the so-called German party, that were limpidly telling that the Thököly had sold himself to the Turk and he was that simply a traitor and of his lord, of the emperor, right? He should have never been a servant of the Ottoman. The Hungarians should have been serfs to the Habsburgs, right? This was, of course, going against the cause of Christianity. Right, it's part of, probably also Louis XIV was surprised by the Habsburgic behavior because, as we've seen, he had pushed for actually creating some sort of further, hostility. And here, the Habsburgs were not simply reacting; were actually giving ground without even fighting. Right, this was, what the heck is that? So this was a veritable disaster all across the board. For example, the Hungarian Protestants understood at this point that it wasn't much about Thököly that they should think as their leader, but really the Padishah of Buda. Right, that was the thing. Like, they depended now on the Ottomans. Without the governor of Buda, the Habsburgs would have never act so meekly, right? And so now, thanks to the Sultan that scared Vienna so much, they could think the unthinkable. In fact, the compaction of a greater Hungarian power. The same went for, we said about the French. At that point, even the Margrave of Baden and the bishops in Italy really didn't have much of a card. Like, they had presented, as we've seen, this wall, acting as if the Habsburgs were confident. Instead, now the same, Vienna had backed down, so the bluff had been uncovered in front of the Sun King. There were so many that the colonnage, look, again, the diplomatic situation is pretty messed up by this situation. So the Turk was the fortune of the Lutherans. So the Catholic Germans expressed themselves in those years, and not just the Lutherans, because as you know, Thököly's party was mostly Calvinist. Like properly, the elites were actually more radical than the average Hungarian Protestant was. I think there were lots of Lutherans, especially in the lower strata of the population. Thököly was acquiring prestige as a major lord, which naturally was a lord in the Ottoman style to some degree. He strengthened his ties with the Grand Vizier and his supporters in the silent pavilions of the Serai that stood high on the Golden Horn, in the belief that actually the same Austria was done for, right? And hadn't this dynamic occurred, as you've seen, the sort of it happened only in a matter of a few months, really. The Ottomans would have probably neither even thought to attack Vienna, at least in the way they did in 1683. There would have been something similar, but again, the strategic situation would have been very, very different. All this was also the merit of Louis XIV. That really had, he was an incredibly determined person. He had consistently backed the Hungarian rebels and the same Ottoman success in Hungary. The same Sun King, as we said before, was generally convinced that at least the German party at the Viennese court would have actually prevailed, right? And that the Habsburgs would have actually committed all their resources on the Danube, but even him was wrong. This naturally helped him in part in Germany, but he had literally as heavily underestimated both the hatred and the fear that he had been able to inspire. Right, Leopold followed the indications of the Spanish party, also because actually the Habsburgs cared a lot about Lorraine, Alsace, right? These were respectively old and new affronts, and the German dimension seemed, in perspective, sort of more ancestrally relevant. It's not like the Habsburgs cared too much about Hungary, if not in this sort of militarized frontier sense. Yes, there were resources that, as we've seen, they also maintained there, but in a sense that, let's say, the territories lost to the Thököly and to the Turks seemed sort of expandable in comparison to the loss of German lands in the West to the French king. That was also, as you know, like basically the gold standard historically Catholicism, and this is of course like a post-Westphalian word, which doesn't actually mean anything. This was true also before Westphalia. Think about during the 30 Years' War, how the French, the most Catholic French, were repressing the Huguenots at home, were actually siding with the Swedes in Germany. So this was really, it was actually a brilliant policy. Like Louis XIV and his predecessors managed to restore an order in their country that was not to be given for granted, also in terms of military power and so on. So politics is very complex, to say the least. And so Louis XIV admitted that Leopold I, albeit paying this very high Danubian price, had actually did something that placed him, at least, in a bit of a difficult situation. It was actually a debacle in the region. But, and we've seen it also in another videos, gradually Sweden Bavaria, Poland had actually broken their alliance with France, and the emperor had secured this way not just new allies to some extent, since with Poland there were always ambiguous relations, but also and especially the support of the papacy in Venice, which the latter especially, and plus Poland indeed, were all sort of relevant in the face of a possible Ottoman threat. So even though everything that had happened was not good at all, and we can't really say here politically or diplomatically how much of this had actually been wanted by Leopold or by his advisors, whatever. There was a balance was formed as far as the French containment was entailed. This emboldened the Turks, however, or at least the French were, of course, allied with them, and 1683 is at the gates. But even as far as that, there was really no certainty at this point. So you have to see it in hindsight and realizing that given the meager Habsburgic resources, this deal, as twisted as it was still absurdly challenging for a power like the one of the Sun King. And so this sort of partially backfired as far as the French were concerned. Leopold, by the way, had summoned I don't know how to call it, because this was not a diet or whatever, it was just like a meeting in Frankfurt am Main, so reinforcing first the imperial grandeur of the Franks, and in very western Germany, compared to, say, not just Vienna, but considering how close, in fact, the French had come from the other side, to adopt a sort of intransigent attitude towards the French. This is clear in the revendications written in the Deductio pro Iuribus Imperii, issued on October the 26th, 1682, in which all the acts of réunion, right, all the champs de réunion that had been unilaterally proposed by the French crown, by digging into sort of most obscure feudal laws or even making them up, from previous centuries, were illegitimate and justified. And so there was no right, of course, that the French had into the Western German lands. If anything, the empire should have recovered much of the territories that the French now occupied, historically as legally. And as a consequence of this deductio, this declaration, the Habsburgs were basically declaring that, in fact, such French conquests had to be reverted. In consequence of that declaration, the French delegates that had actually participated to the Frankfurt meeting had left, because this was basically telling them nuts, and together with any negotiate, and in any case, those talks would have resumed anyway in Regensburg shortly afterwards, and coming a bit closer to Austria in another context. And when the aforementioned deductio by the imperials was presented, the choice would have actually led to further concessions to Thököly, so insisting this kind of, again, save everything that can be saved with the Ottomans, than giving anything to the French. So better the infidels, in a sense the Habsburgs repaid the French their same coin, better the infidels than these treacherous, say, confessionals, And here, sorry, it could be interesting at some point to look at what was happening more in detail, of course, in the Western frontier. However, this wasn't over, right? What I like to leave you with in these things, and sometimes sounding pedantic and not seemingly even reaching the point, because there is no point to be reached. I mean, everything evolves continuously. And of course, the French wouldn't sit there doing nothing. There is no isolated reality. There's not something in the world that happens and it must be the same. It always changes at every moment. It doesn't matter what you want it to be. It always does. And if you don't cope with it constantly, you're simply going under anyway. So what does the Sun King do? He failed, as we've seen, with Austria, with Poland, with Sweden, with Bavaria. And his plot seemed much better, much more resistantly noted in Constantinople, right? And what actually will prompt further change on the bigger scale of things will be actually the boundless ambition of the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, that in very historically mysterious ways, because we do not really have any document telling us how, let's say, what was actually said when. We do know the decision was essentially taken, would actually decide, in fact, for the Viennese expedition. And so, evaluating, assessing the situation, I understand, of course, it was an enormous feat to pull off, and that he required the sultanial support, which did arrive, which was a thing that, had, of course, its own weight. Otherwise, it could have not been done anyway. Seemed like the most concrete opportunity to knock out entirely the Habsburgic power. And these are rare, say, it's not rare for powers to be a step away from collapse, but it is normally a much sort of smoother, slower collapse, right? It's something that can happen in different ways. This was literally the attempted conquest of Vienna. And so one of the major military operations in relative terms, like in the history of mankind, for the times and places. It's something that we have covered and we'll keep covering to express like all this, the complexity stemming essentially from the background into this operation, meaning that what happens historically is the fruit of so many circumstances that get often forgotten in very simplistic ways, and that instead produce sometimes these major events from apparently banal causes. And of course, with a lot of sort of, say, more substantial background, but pretty intricate one that could have simply essentially been bypassed to a degree. Now, we will see this, of course, continuing our look at the situation in other episodes. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.